Okay, I've been asked to do this for a while now. Why are the pros now playing Hammer rather than why didn't they play her before and why are they playing her now? She doesn't quite have the popularity that you've seen in a lot of my other videos of usually 20 to 30% or more of the game scene, but she is being played more and more and people can't really figure out why. So ultimately, Hammer is picked oftentimes as a last pick on maps where she can get a lot of value off of sitting still, having a long range, and getting a lot of value off. Now, her I find that one of the most common times that she's drafted and it turns into a win is when the enemies don't draft mages. And I know that sounds a little strange because you usually have that in there at some point. But mages are some of Hammer's hardest counters because they can stack usually off of her pretty easily. They can do a lot of damage to her with just in burst uh, times. She's just in general, she struggles against mages. She also struggles against people with multiple swaps or hooks. People that, if you can trigger her unstoppable once and then sending off another hook or when that ends, things like that, she has trouble with. The last reason that Sergeant Hammer is drafted is for the level 20 power spike. It's pretty rare for most places to draft off the level 20 power spike because you don't normally get to level 20. However, on Tomb of the Spider Queen, on Towers of Doom, you'll often see that games reach level 20, especially in the pro area. And you can see that in the times where they hit level 20 and they pick Orbital, they have over a 50% win rate, despite, and the other times that they pick the capacitors, it's usually a little bit lower on average. So we see that this is a very strong pick and something that we'll see over and over and over. So the build that is being picked up the most for pro players is Ambush at level 1, all the way down the line. Ambush allows for a few things to happen. One, it allows you to set up in an area where the enemies might not know where you are. Two, it allows it to where you can body block bushes from people like tracers who can't reveal you for a little while. And three, it just is a little bit more burst damage on the first hit after being sieged, which is a pretty important hit because that's usually the first couple hits are the only ones you're actually going to land against most pro teams because they're just going to walk away from the area until they have their entire group together and then they're going to rush in and try to take you out. Level 4, it's almost always the siege tactics, giving you unstoppable, preventing you from getting hooked or flipped into the enemy team. Level 7, hover siege is almost always picked up. It allows you to move around a little bit when you get go into your siege mode. As opposed to the increased range, which is picked up in a lot of scenarios, Hover Siege allows you to where you can attack, move. It also synergizes a little bit with some of the other abilities that you have, granting attack speed and moving around really quickly. And it makes it to where people can't really get away from you, as you can keep moving with your team as they're fighting. Level 10, and it allows you to like move away from AoEs and stuff. Level 10, it's always Blunt Force Gun at the BFG. So the reason that it's always BFG, sorry for the coughs, guys. Again, still have a cold. The reason that it's always BFG is because you're going to be getting out a lot of damage. It's a lot of burst damage, and it gives you the opportunity for that level 20 power spike. However, it's mainly just for the burst damage. It's global. You can hit people all the way across the area, meaning that you could be like in top lane, dropping something and send down a BFG down in bottom lane. Level 13, there are two options that are picked up. Either the knockback distance is increased by 75%, or the cooling, which means that while in siege mode, hitting heroes with basic attacks reduces the cooldown of your thrusters. The more you have thrusters, the more you can get out safely. 16, it's always Giant Killer. Always Giant Killer. And 20, it switches between capacitors, which gives you more attack speed, all the way up to 40%, or BFG, which gives you the ability to eventually take out keeps, even if the enemies are trying to stall it away. Both are really good, but the BFG is pretty much game ending if you haven't already taken keeps. So let's get into this game. This game is Team Freedom versus Tempo Storm. Let me turn down the volume just a tad. And we're going to be seeing Fan, who is playing the hammer in this case. And we're going to fast forward through the beginning. You got to remember the beginning for most pro games is pretty boring. I will say that they are not taking the 5-man mid like what you'll normally see. Instead, they are taking a different approach by playing it really safe. Many people consider this because they were worried about the enemies stacking up quests, but their quests really weren't that big of a deal. I think ultimately they wanted to stall mid so that they can take out this early tower as fast as possible. This is something that only really pro teams can get away with, purely because you could try to do this in your games, but it's very, very difficult as people are usually going to try to push against it. As you can see, they drafted Sergeant Hammer into a no mage composition, and the reason why is because no one can really threaten the Sergeant Hammer purely because they don't have any large AoEs that can do anything to her. So Hammer quickly takes out the towers that were bottom lane and then decides to head over and go mid lane. Now that Hammer is level 4, we see that Hammer already has the ambush as well as the plating, the siege tactics. This allows Hammer to essentially not have to worry about any CC. And the great part about Hammer, why I love Hammer on some of these maps where there's an objective here, is especially against their team, they don't have enough damage. Tracer and Genji both would have to dive together to take out the Hammer, but the Hammer could stay invisible for as long as needed. And do you see what ETC is doing right here? ETC is positioning himself to where if anyone dives on Hammer, he can immediately knock them away, stun them, and during this time, that's going to be 3 or 4 auto attacks from Hammer. Then you can also see the positioning of Malfurion keeping the heals and everything else on Hammer as well, making sure that no one can do anything to Hammer. And by the way, June is not using the banner for his team. I just figured I would mention that in case anyone wanted to know. And then Hammer goes back to what Hammer does best, which is long-range structure damage. And the other reason why pros can get away with this is because they have people who are dedicated on dealing with the minions, as well as someone who's dedicated on dealing with enemies. They focus on trying to essentially keep up an experience, but ultimately, as long as they keep doing structure damage, there's nothing that can be done. But you got to remember, every time that Hammer is attacking anything but a structure, Hammer's wasting time. So you can watch this Greymane, how he handles the minion waves right here. He throws a Q, but watch. He's going to jump in, and he's going to deal with this minion wave as fast as possible. And then it allows Hammer to go back through and start pushing again. And just barely gets in range, and you can see them just dropping it between the Hammer and the Greymane. Greymane's got his W going. They're just doing a ton of damage. Greymane can hop out, more damage being dealt, and there's no mages to deal with this. They would need pretty much their whole team to jump on him, and when their whole team rotates, you can see that ETC jumps right on the Hammer and knocks people away. Something that the pros are doing that would be much more difficult to do than in a regular regular composition. Now that he has hover, he can kind of hover in whenever he needs to, clear a few minions and hover in. They're going to be going for boss, and looks like Team Freedom's really making a decision. They know that they can't kill the Hammer until level 10, so they're going to do whatever they can to try to trade things. If the Hammer's going to be taking one objective, they need to be taking something else. If the Hammer's going to take top fort, they need to take bottom fort. Overall, Team Freedom's doing exactly what they need to do, but they do kind of Tempo Storm scares them off a little bit. I'm actually surprised they were able to scare him off purely because the Hammer was so far away. You can see how the hover siege is really nice for just repositioning, still getting off the damage, attack moving, and kind of just waddling away. It's a nice way to stay in range of everything that you need while avoiding a lot of unnecessary damage. We're going to fast forward just a little bit. I want to try to keep these a little bit shorter, especially whenever I pause. Want to make sure that the rest of the gameplay works out. Sieging slightly out of range. You can see the double dive that immediately goes on, and the team jumps to their aid. But the entire comp is based around this one hammer. So you can see how fast everyone goes to the peeling aspect. And that's all that they need to do. Team Freedom realizes they just need to jump on him. So now this is where June's going to have to make a very difficult decision. Does he want to go Tranquility to keep the hammer alive through everything? Or does he want to go Twilight Dream so when the double people dive in, he can silence both of them, their team can go in on this? Ultimately, it's really up to him and the playstyle of his team. I personally would go with Tranquility because if they can win the initial burst from a Tracer and a Genji, then they have nothing left to worry about. So I personally would go with the Tranquility, but we might see a Twilight Dream. We'll see. Level 20, we see Napalm picked up instead of the BFG. Napalm usually is if you have specific objectives you need to do a lot of damage to really quickly. Usually it's for maps that have bosses or for things that you need to race on. And I think that they're not really worried about the game lasting long enough for that level 20 power spike. And again, we see just the hovering around, and you see the posturing from the enemy team as they are going to try to do everything they can to jump on this hammer as soon as possible. You're going to see the Tracer jump in from probably over here, Genji from over here. And while they are able to hold this objective, the Genji will probably interrupt. Yep. And we're going to see a lot of people jump in. But the hover is really interesting as the hover can just kind of keep going into stealth, keep hovering around, and get a lot of value. Kind of forces the enemies not to be able to do anything unless they could jump in full force. Hover also makes it to where the X-Strike doesn't get the full damage off. Immediately goes in, gets the napalm off, clears up the entire wave. And you can see the attack moving is something that you don't normally see with a lot of hammers. When he goes hover, Fan likes to attack, move, so that he's still repositioning as much as he can. And look at all this damage that he's doing. It's just an incredible, incredible amount of damage. The boss, the curse, everything, they're already applying so much pressure. There's nothing that Team Freedom can do. And there's been no kills on either team. It's purely been the macro play, and look at how much they are playing around this hammer. Hammer's outranging the towers, outranging everything, and their entire team is focused on peeling for this hammer. We see the Tranquility picked up. He's doing everything in his power to keep the hammer alive long enough so that they can outlast the amount of burst that's going on the enemy team. We saw X-Strike and Archon already used, so they could stay in this fight longer if they would like to. However, they don't really need to do that. They've already taken so much and done a huge chunk of damage onto this. So you can definitely see that they just didn't feel the need for BFG. They just felt like it. They already could take keeps on their own purely because their composition just completely surrounds this hammer. So it allows Hammer to safely deal damage. It's kind of what Hanzo, if you remember my series or my Why the Pros pick Hanzo, they picked him because he's just the safest way to do damage. And this is essentially what they're doing is they're replacing Hanzo with a hammer, and hammer can do more structure damage than a Hanzo can and still poke just as much as a Hanzo could. Hammer just doesn't have the CC, and hammer also gets countered by mages while Hanzo doesn't. So if you draft hammer into a composition without mages on the enemy team, it's pretty safe to take people out whenever you need to. Simply apply the hover, have everyone surround the hammer, and let the hammer just slowly poke down things one structure at a time. There's no way that they have enough damage to finish him off. So you might be asking yourself, well, Paradox, how do we counter this? You counter this by running mages that can jump on this. If everyone's clustered like this, a Ring of Frost plus an Icy Veins melts their whole team. It even just a Kel'Thas that could cause them to spread out because of all the bombs, or else they're going to be infinitely bouncing around bombs. Anything that can thrive against clustered compositions, a Zarya that can pull everyone together, a Phoenix that can blow everyone up, a Leoric, anything like that can really thrive against one of these situations. But if you don't have that, if you're focused on really heroes that are great at picking down individual people, unfortunately they just don't have enough damage to burst through the extra armor gained from Neo Steel plating as well as the extra healing done by the Malfurion. And it doesn't need to be a Malfurion either. Anyone who has a lot of healing can really outdo just about any of the damage that a Tracer and a Genji can give. So they really needed to play a different composition. all in all, Tempo Storm just outdrafted in general. And now you might be asking, but Paradox, this is with like absolute pro players. Is Hammer still good for Hero League? And that's where I might answer the question as a yes. I mean, a lot of people in your MMR might not like to see Hammer because they're like, oh, the Hammer's always just sitting there getting killed. But Hammer does a lot of things really well. Hammer can apply a lot of pressure, in fact, the most pressure out of just about any heroes in the game in a lane. So if you want to just apply a lot of pressure, that's what Hammer can do really well. The problem that I find is when you do play Hammer in Hero League, most people don't play them well. And I know that sounds really bad, but most people will play Hammer and they'll AFK in a lane, they'll use their siege up, and then they'll just attack and they'll just die. They'll get jumped on, they'll get jumped on, they'll get jumped on. The only time you should be sieging up in a lane and applying pressure is when you know where everyone is on the map and you know what the pressure is actually going to do. You know how much damage the enemies can do, and you don't need to worry about that damage. That's the only time you should be sieging up in lane. But I wouldn't say one-tricking Hammer is going to be your best way to Grandmaster. I mean, it happened with a couple people. I won't name any names, Polita. But it does work for some people. However, I think that Hammer would be best used by learning what Hammer does well, and then essentially only picking Hammer into the drafts that you know is going to lead to a win. Meaning the drafts where they don't have a heavy mage presence, they don't have things that can just jump on you, get stacks off on you. For example, like a Chromie versus a Hammer is always challenging. And why do I say it's always challenging? Because Chromie can get a free Q stack over and over and over. And if Chromie gets the Q that will stack up faster if she gets them in a row, then Chromie's going to be doing loads of damage with her Q, pretty much doing anywhere from 60 to 70% of your health with Q late game, and it's going to be impossible to deal with. But if you can play Hammer like Fan or like Polita, then I say go for it. Essentially just play in Hero League and start getting good with Hammer. But if you can't, and if you're someone that just likes to stay in siege mode all the time, you can see how little he's actually staying in siege mode. He only stays in siege mode when his entire team's there with him, or if he knows where everyone else is on the map. But in every other situation, you can see how he's staying outside of siege mode, and even in siege mode, he's attack moving the entire time. If you can do that, then feel free to play Hammer. But overall, that is why the pros are playing Hammer right now, is because it's sort of countering one of the most common compositions that we're seeing, which is the individual or double dive composition, because they can dive in, but they don't have enough damage to kill anyone in the backline, which effectively means that once they burn out of their main damage, they're kind of out. They don't have anything else to finish off anything, and the Hammer can effectively just slowly apply pressure. Hammer applies a lot of the same pressure that does a lot of the same things that Hanzo does. Long range, very very safe damage, but Hanzo can't do damage to structures, while Hammer can. So that's essentially why the pros are playing Hammer right now. If you haven't watched it already, I did a Why the Pros Play Hanzo, and it kind of explains the other aspect of this. I actually really like the fact that the pros are picking up Hammer. She hasn't been played a lot in pro play. Seeing her being picked up and actually winning with her quite a bit is really cool, and it applies something different. It makes us need to change around things in the meta. Because we've seen the same meta for a while now, where you see a poke hero like a Hanzo and then a dive hero like a Genji, where they get people low enough, dive in, get resets, and it's been getting kind of boring, honestly. So I like seeing that people are changing up the meta, and I like seeing a protect the blank comp. What I mean by that is a composition that focuses around one individual person that everyone kind of just focuses on protecting the entire game. And I like those compositions because we haven't seen those in a few seasons, so I think that's pretty neat. Overall, thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. Feel free to subscribe. Check out some of my other Why the Pros Play, and there's some other series that I've got going on, like 4 Mistakes and some other ones. Overall, thanks again.